Good afternoon, EDH enthusiasts. I'm Flynn, and welcome to a Commander deck video. We are knee-deep within the cuddle confines of Bloomburrow, but one of the coolest parts of this set is the Calamities, a series of creatures who don't quite fall into the categories of either cute or cuddly, and are largely considered to be the threats of this plane. One such is Ygra, Eater of All, who is a 6/6 elemental cat for 3, a black and a green. It has a ward cost of sacrificing a food. Other creatures are food artifacts in addition to their other types, and they gain the food ability to pay 2, tap, and sacrifice this permanent to gain 3 life. Lastly, whenever a food is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you put 2+1/+1 counters onto Ygra. Ygra is perhaps the best food-themed commander at the moment, or at the very least, it's a very strong contender of such. It makes every creature in play into a food artifact, which has a lot of relevance when you're building up synergies. We can play into that ability with some cards that either care about foods or about artifacts, and this is something I took into consideration while putting together this list. It has a ward cost of sacrificing a food, which means that an opponent has to sacrifice a creature if they control no food tokens just to target it, which either way will trigger Ygra's third ability, putting 2+1/+1 counters onto itself. The deck we will be looking at today looks to combine the aristocrat style of sacrifice with food themed cards that will gain tremendous momentum with Ygra in play, and with just a sprinkling of support for those +1/+1 counters. See, if Ygra grows large enough, we can absolutely pivot to an approach where we just swing in with Ygra to take opponents out. In Commander, if you take 21 or more points of combat damage from a commander, you lose the game, and so Ygra can absolutely grow large enough to threaten opponents. Let's start out by looking at the cards that we can feast upon for sacrifice and food. Accursed Marauder is a 2-drop that requires each player sacrifice a non-token creature. We've had numerous cards with abilities like this in the past, an enter ability that forces an edict effect on each player, but the Marauder is a 2-drop rather than the typical 3-drop most of the predecessors were in. If Ygra is in play, that converts into 2+1/+1 counters for each creature sacrificed, including the Marauder. Camellia the Seed Miser is part of a combo engine with this deck, giving us a squirrel token whenever we sacrifice a food. This can go infinite with Ygra and a free sack outlet, and while Camellia has a bunch of other text on her, I'm really not interested in that as much as I am the token producing clause. Carrion Feeder is a 1-drop with a free sack outlet on it, giving itself a +1/+1 counter whenever you sacrifice a creature. Sometimes we do need to find a way to sacrifice our creatures since Ygra has no inherent outlet on its own, and this being a 1-drop with no additional cost to sacrifice makes it an amazing option. Cauldron Familiar is part of a combo that we can build up in this deck. When it enters, each opponent loses 1 life, and we gain 1 life. You can also sacrifice a food to return the familiar from the graveyard onto the battlefield. If we have any free sack outlet in play, such as the Carrion Feeder, and a card like Camellia who makes tokens upon our foods being sacrificed, in play with Ygra, if this is in the battlefield, we can win the game. It seems like a bit of work, but the familiar needs a food soak and sacrifice to return to the battlefield, when it then drains the table. We sacrifice the familiar, making a squirrel with the example here, which is then part food. We then sacrifice the squirrel snack to return the familiar, and then we can repeat the cycle until the game is won. This also works very well with the next card. Experimental Confectioner is a 2/3 for 3 with an enter ability that creates a food token. Whenever you sacrifice a food, you create a 1/1 black rat creature token that can't block. This also goes infinite with a sack outlet like the Carrion Feeder and Ygra in play. See, with Ygra out, those rats also become food, and since the Confectioner makes us a rat whenever we sacrifice a food, we can do this loops as many times as we wish. This can be to trigger out our aristocrat abilities infinitely, or trigger Ygra to make them infinitely huge. Feasting Troll King is a 7/6 for 6 mana with both Trample and Vigilance. When it enters, if you've cast it from your hand, you create 3 food tokens. You can also sacrifice 3 foods to return the Troll King to the battlefield from the graveyard, but this can only be activated during your turn. Again, we're on a huge amount of synergy with Ygra, as the sacrifice of those 3 foods will give Ygra 6 +1/+1 counters. And the creatures that we have in play can also be used, since they will too be considered food. We are limited to only doing this on our turn, but this can be a great way to help set up our endgame. Gilded Goose is basically a mana dork that can produce food tokens and sacrifice food to make colored mana, making this perhaps the perfect mana dork for this deck. Peregrine Took gives us an extra food token whenever we would make any number of tokens. We can also sacrifice 3 foods to draw a card. This is huge as we can turn our creatures into card draw and trigger Ygra further. Pippin is also here, the Warren of Isengard, and can create food tokens, as well as use our food tokens to give our other creatures +3/+3 and haste until the end of turn. Provisions Merchant creates a food upon it entering, and then when it attacks, we can sacrifice a food to give our attacking creatures +1/+1 and trample until the end of turn. This is one of a handful of cards included to potentially give Ygra trample. See, Ygra can become infinitely huge, but without trample, it's going to be hard to get that damage through. Giving it trample makes it far more dangerous, as now opponents will have to throw a lot more in its way to prevent themselves from being taken out. And remember, each of those creatures that Ygra kills in combat only strengthens it further from those +1/+1 counters. Savvy Hunter is also similar to the Peregrine Took, creating foods upon it attacking or blocking, and we can sacrifice 2 foods in order to draw a card. Warren Soul Trader has another technically free sack outlet on it, this one coming with the additional cost of paying 1 life along with sacrificing a creature, but then you create a treasure token. This can be great if we're behind in mana and need some ramp, as we'll trigger all the things and goodies while making a treasure token. White of the Reliquary gets bigger the more creatures that exist in our graveyard, but what really makes this card incredible is that we can tap it, sacrifice another creature, to tutor for any land card to put into play tapped. This doesn't have any stipulations on the land that you can search for, only that it enters play tapped. There are certain lands that we will want in certain situations, so this will be perfect for getting those out when we need them. Nuka-Cola Vending Machine is a food token producer, but also has a triggered ability that gives us a tapped treasure token whenever we sacrifice a food. This is another amazing source of ramp in this deck, although I'm curious how Bloomburrow survived the Great War and had Nuka-Cola machines installed. The Underworld Cookbook has 2 great abilities on it. We can tap in and discard a card to create a food token. We can also pay 4, tap and sacrifice the cookbook to return target creature card from our graveyard to our hand. This deck doesn't do a lot of reanimation per se, however there are some cards like the Cauldron Familiar and the Troll King that we would want to have in the graveyards as setup for a combo later on. And this card is an excellent way to ensure that we have the cards where we need when we need them. Witch's Oven is a bit of a slower sack outlet, letting us tap it and sacrificing a creature to create a food token. If that creature's toughness was 4 or greater, we actually get 2 foods. Scavenger's Talent is a 1-drop class enchantment with 3 levels. At the base level, whenever 1 or more creatures you control dies, you create a food token, but this ability only triggers once per turn. For 2 mana, it ascends to level 2, where it gains the triggered ability, where whenever you sacrifice a permanent, target opponent mills 2 cards. Finally, for 3 mana, we reach level 3, where at the end step, you may sacrifice 3 other non-land permanents, and if you do, return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. This is tremendously strong, as we get a food token to replace one of our dead creatures. We can also begin milling opponents, which can be a win condition should we achieve one of our infinite food sacrifice loops. Lastly, we get a pretty good source of reanimation. Finality counters simply exile the creature that has one of them on it as they die, replacing them going to the graveyard, but doesn't do anything beyond that. Lastly, Viridian Revel is one of the strongest card draw engines in this game with Ygra out. Whenever any artifact is put into an opponent's graveyard from the battlefield, you may draw a card. Ygra makes every creature into a food artifact, meaning that any creature that dies, be they token or non-token, or used to go for Ygra's ward cost, they will let us draw a card. It's also a May ability, so in the possibility that you would deck yourself out by drawing too much, you can choose to simply not draw the card. So now that we have our ways to get our food and feast, we want ways to take advantage of it. Cards like Blood Artist, Disciple of the Vault, Marionette Apprentice, Marionette Master, and the Zulaport Cutthroat all drain opponents of life whenever a creature dies, or in some cases an artifact, meaning that all of these creatures that Ygra is making into food artifacts will make our opponents miserable with all the drain effects. Bone Cache Overseer lets us tap it and pay 1 life to draw a card, but we can only use this ability if we've either had 3 or more cards leave our graveyard, or if we've sacrificed a food this turn. And it shouldn't be too difficult to get that ability live. Hazel's Brewmaster is a 4-drop squirrel with Menace. Whenever it enters or attacks, you can exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard and create a food token. Foods you control have all activated abilities of all creature cards exiled with the Brewmaster. This is so good, and it can lead into some interesting board states. We aren't on a whole ton of activated abilities in our own deck, but since all of our board could be foods, abilities such as Pippin's food creating ability or the Carrion Feeder's ability to put +1/+1 counters on itself could be useful. You can also target opponent graveyards to get their best cards exiled, and should they have some potent abilities in the bin, we can use them to our advantage. Pitiless Plunderer is in the deck, as is my beloved Shatterfang, as the two can go infinite between the two of them. Rotten Mouth Viper is another one of the calamities that I just love in this deck. Its mana value is 6, but as an additional cost to cast this spell, you may sacrifice any number of non-land permanents. And then, this spell costs 1 less for each permanent sacrificed this way. Whenever it attacks or blocks, you put a blight counter on it. Then, for each blight counter on it, each opponent loses 4 life unless they either sacrifice a non-land permanent or discards a card. This is such a cool resource denial card. As it begins to build up blight counters, your opponents will be more pressed to take that 4 damage. See, they can't pay a cost they can't afford, and so if they no longer control non-land permanents or have no cards in hand, they will have to take that 4 damage for each blight counter. And so as the more you build up the blight counters on this thing, the more they will be backed into the corner. Rampage of the Clans is a unique board wipe in this deck. It destroys all artifacts and enchantments, and then for each permanent destroyed this way, its controller creates a 3/3 Grease Centaur. If Ygra is in play, this will clear out all creatures except itself, giving it a ton of counters and possibly sending you up to take an opponent out of the game. Our last part will go into the unique synergies that dive into +1/+1 counters and just general relevance with Ygra. Perhaps my favorite of them is the Feline Sovereign, a 2/3 cat for 3. It gives other cats you control +1/+1 and protection from dogs. Whenever one or more cats you control deals combat damage to a player, you may destroy up to 1 target artifact or enchantment that player controls. So remember, for the umpteenth time, Ygra makes all creatures into food artifacts, and so if Ygra connects with an opponent, you can blow up one of their cards. This is a really interesting piece of tech that has minimal synergy with the rest of the deck, but in the event that you have to pivot into attacking with Ygra for a commander damage victory, this can be a helpful tool to have to remove one of the pesky cards on your opponent's boards. Manglehorn is a 3-drop that as it enters, it destroys target artifact. While Manglehorn is in play, artifacts your opponents control enter tapped. This is devastating while Ygra is in play. Since those cards are all artifacts, all creatures will enter the battlefield tapped, and so your opponent will struggle to put up defenses against your attacks. Duskshell Crawler and Pridemalkin do basically the same thing. They give out a +1/+1 counter to a target creature upon them entering, and then they give creatures with +1/+1 counters on them trample. If we've had opponents wall up against Ygra getting through, this can be an ideal and simple way to push through. Cranial Plating is another fun piece of tech that works very well with Ygra. This card gives the equipped creature +1/+0 for each artifact we control. And since Ygra makes our creatures artifacts, the more creatures we have in play, the bigger the equipped creature grows. The unique thing with this card is because it has an activated ability costing 2 black mana to equip, you can have it equip at instant speed in response to an opponent not blocking a creature, getting in for a ton of damage. Inspiring Sanctuary also comes in here, giving our non-artifact spells Improvise. See, our creatures are only considered artifacts once they've hit the battlefield, and so we can use our artifacts to help pay the generic costs for our cards. Power Fist can be backbreaking on Ygra. This 2-drop equipment gives trample. Whenever the equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, you put that many +1/+1 counters on it. If this is equipped to a creature and that creature is unblocked, we're basically doubling its power. And again, it's a very clean way to give Ygra trample. Now, since we are utilizing a decent amount of +1/+1 counters, namely on Ygra, we do want to failsafe should it get targeted by removal. The Ozolith is my go-to for this, as any time a creature you control would leave the battlefield, if it had any counters on it, you put those counters onto the Ozolith. At the beginning of combat on your turn, we can move all of the counters on the Ozolith onto a target creature, meaning that if Ygra dies, we can safely store those counters for reuse later on. Ygra is such a fun commander to build up, and you have this creature that's already tricky to deal with, and the sheer number of support cards that food decks now have to make this such a spicy deck. The main goals of this deck are to make the food tokens, or get Ygra out and make every creature into a food, and then we use those food tokens to begin gaining value off of their sacrifice. If somehow our engine fails or our combos are interrupted, chances are Ygra will be large enough to simply pivot into just pouncing on opponents for game. But for now, that will bring our discussion of Ygra to a close. What do you think of this deck? Are there other legends from Bloomburrow you'd like us to explore? Let me know in the comments. I truly hope you enjoyed this video. If so, likes and shares are among the best ways to help this channel to continue growing. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a future video. With that, I appreciate all of you for hanging out with me today. My name is Flynn, and I'll catch you all next video.